Good morning, everybody. Daresay and everybody that's contributed to this morning wants to say a very, very welcome to all of you. Fantastic to see all of you here, and that we are so many gathered here today around the subject business value through design. Design is a kind of broad subject, and today we will touch upon different perspective on what design is, what it means, what value design can bring to business, and also what could be good to think of when starting to or scaling up activities around design thinking and customer-centric ways of working. So it's time for me to introduce our first speaker. We're proud to welcome Jeanne Liedka. Jeanne Liedka, Professor of Business Administration, the University of Virginia, Darden School of Business. Jeanne's over 30 years of research and teaching within design thinking and strategy has resulted in several books, such as Designing for Growth, which is a toolkit for design for managers, and Design Thinking for the Greater Good, which is about innovation in social sector. She's been profiled as Thinkers 50 thought leader in business, and now she's here actually for the first time in Sweden.
Yes.
To talk about business value of design. And I can tell I'm truly impressed by the clarity that you bring to the field of design and business. Really pleasure to listen when you're talking.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, it is absolutely wonderful to be here in Stockholm, and thank you for the invitation that I've been able to come and spend time with. It is a daunting invitation because to fit into a short period of time a discussion of why design works, I think is a challenge. We've been doing research following organizations using design thinking in particular projects for about 10 years now. And so we have a lot of data that looks at the different ways design has an impact. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about that impact, spend a moment talking about my definition of design thinking and how we've operationalized it, tell a short story from our research that demonstrates how it can work in practice, and then to look across the broader research base at some of the different kinds of impact. So I hope you will think of this as the beginning of a long conversation around design thinking. So let's start. There's been a lot of talk of design thinking quite recently. We have the Forrester report that some of you may have seen by the Forrester organization following IBM's design thinking practice. And of course, IBM is probably the company that has at this point in time invested more resources in hiring designers and in truly trying to integrate a design thinking practice into all of their consulting work. So Forrester compared matched teams of IBM consultants, some who'd been taught and were using the design thinking methodology, and some who were using IBM's traditional methodology in this study. McKinsey, of course, has also gotten on the bandwagon. I spent my early years as a strategy consultant at the Boston Consulting Group, so as a consultant, you never want to miss an opportunity, right? And so McKinsey has examined 5 years worth of data from, I think, 300 firms. On a variety of dimensions, looking at what they see as the design thinking outcomes. And so as we look at that, the Forrester study showed a 301% return on investment. In fact, what was interesting is we've spent time with the Forrester people, and what they tell us is that they actually had to keep working to bring their numbers down because their original return on investment was too high for anyone to believe. Similarly, the McKinsey show has demonstrated significant 32 percentage points from a revenue viewpoint and 56% improvement in shareholder return over firms that were significant investors in design and design thinking. We also know that that innovation is a top priority for all organizations in this world. For me, innovation is kind of the new quality, right? If we think about it, at one point in time, we thought that quality was something that a small group of people called quality control specialists did in organizations, and that no one else needed to do it. But then we discovered that, in fact, quality was a basic capability for competitive advantage, and everyone had to be literate in the language of quality, which total quality management made possible, and more recently now, Six Sigma, Lean, we have a whole set of techniques. Well, I think we're experiencing the same thing in innovation. In a world of uncertainty and change, where the source of competitive advantage is really not stable anymore as it once was, everyone needs to innovate. And for me, the way TQM allowed us to take an abstract concept like quality and make it part of everyone's day-to-day practices, the parallel with innovation is that design thinking can do the same thing for us. It can give us a teachable, scalable set of tools that can allow us to give everyone in an organization a voice in the innovation process. So that's what I really would like to talk about today a bit. So let me talk about my definition of design thinking, and of course there are as many definitions as there are academics and consultants writing on the subject. But for me, coming out of a business environment where we have many tools for decision making, right? And many of those tools are valid and useful, right? What makes us think that we need to add yet another toolkit called design thinking? Well, for me, there are three basic beliefs in design thinking, or core principles, that really differentiate it from most of what we're still teaching our MBAs as ways to think in business. The first is that it starts with the user, right? So often when we talk about innovation, we think innovation starts with technology. Or innovation starts with what we as organizations are good at doing and want to do more of. Design thinking, quite specifically, steps away from our own capabilities and our own interests and our own technologies and says, if we want to innovate, we must first begin with a deep understanding of the needs of the people that we're trying to innovate for, the needs of the people we're trying to create value for. And so designers talk a great deal about empathy, right? Now, in my old days as a strategy consultant, we would have called that the identification of unarticulated needs, right? And we know that the identification of unarticulated needs is the single most reliable way to get to profitable business growth. Right? Because if you wait for customers to tell you what they need, they tend to tell all of your competitors at the same time. And so you begin a process of innovation already in head-to-head competition. If we can figure out what people need before they are able to tell us, then we have the basis for a significant kind of competitive advantage. So although empathy kind of sounds like something that is all touchy-feely and kind of a little bit soft and circumspect, empathy is actually the root to, I think, the surest source of competitive advantage, in that it allows us to create value propositions that really target things that people need. The second element of design thinking I'd talk about is the power of being possibility-driven. Design thinking starts by asking the question, if anything were possible, what would we deliver in terms of a service or a product, right? So often in organizations, we are so trained to be constraint-driven that when you invite us to think in new ways, we inevitably fall back on constraints. If we begin a process of innovation and invention by accepting and taking into account all of the constraints we're facing today, we'll never invent a future that looks very different from today. So design thinking insists that in the beginning part of the process, as we generate ideas, we take all of those constraints and we put them aside and we focus exclusively on possibilities. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to ignore constraints. Later in the testing process, we're going to layer them back in. But that sequential attention, that idea generation first with possibilities and only then layering in constraints with testing, is absolutely critical, I think, to breakthrough innovation. And then the third is this focus on iteration. In design thinking, the first answer is only the beginning of a journey. Right? So often in business, we're trained to think that there is one right answer. Right? As a strategist at BCG, we would search for the one right strategy. Well, the reality is, any discussion you have about the future is an invention. The one right strategy, how do we know that? How can we know that until it actually becomes reality? So what designers do, in the same way that venture capitalists do, is they accept the reality of uncertainty, and they accept the fact that they cannot know what idea invented today will be the successful one tomorrow. So for instance, we know from research on the Silicon Valley venture capitalists, the very best ones, when they invest in 10 new businesses, less than 2 of them will ever turn into profitable businesses. Now, do they hang their heads in shame because they invested in 8 wrong businesses? No, they understand that the real trick is to figure out as much when to stop investing as when to start. So they start with 10 because they cannot know which 2 until they travel down a journey of learning that separates the 8 that won't work from the 2 that do. Right? And that's what design thinking gives us a tool for. A tool that is very challenging. I think if you look at this notion of replacing analysis with experimentation, it is one of the dominant themes across business initiatives today. Whether we're talking about lean startup, whether we're talking about agile software development, whether we're talking about design thinking, the core, all 3 of those methodologies share, is that they substitute real-world experimentation for analysis with data from the past. Most of us have been so trained to extrapolate from the past that the idea of designing and executing experiments is challenging and takes a lot of work. It's interesting, in business we think we're so data-driven, but the way we're data-driven is we've been taught to take data from the past and try and assess the future with it, right? Which is kind of a losing game. Right? Especially with good finance people who can poke holes in whatever assumptions you're making about that future. Whereas with experimentation, we accept that and we are hypothesis-driven. That is, instead of taking the data we've already got from the past and trying to ask questions about the future, we start by treating any given idea as a hypothesis and saying, what data do I need to get in order to reliably test that? It's such a shift to move from taking the data you've got to identifying the data you need that even the most quantitatively oriented people struggle with the design of experiments in our experience. And so the specific tools design thinking offers are really critical here. So what's in the way? I would talk about the Moses myth. Of course, this isn't actually Moses, it's Charlton Heston. But this myth we have that innovation is done by a select and elite group of special people, right? Whether we're talking about Steve Jobs or Jack Ma or whoever we would talk about, this idea that most of us don't really have it in us, right? So I was trained as an accountant, right? Now, when you're trained as an accountant, it is very clear that you are not one of the creative people. Right? And I think when we think about why we're drawn to this method, why I'm drawn to this method, is because what design thinking offers is a way to demonstrate that I can be one of those creative people. I just need a little bit more structure and help than some other people do. Right? But getting rid of the Moses myth, getting rid of this idea that everyone can't innovate, getting rid of the idea that innovation is about disruption entirely and new technology, I think is one of the beliefs we have to address if we're going to move forward on this. The purpose of innovation is value creation. It is not novelty. So every one of us at every level of an organization has the ability to create better value for the people that we work with. And it's that personal empowerment, I think. The fact that I can say to a teacher, you don't have to wait for the school superintendent to give you permission to use these new models to increase the experience of the children in your classroom. You can go into your classroom tomorrow and make a difference without asking for permission. I think that's one of the really powerful aspects. Now, we've operationalized design thinking in our own work very simply as being around 4 questions. What is asks you to start with current reality. Interesting, we don't rush to the future first. We want to build the future based on an assessment of the needs of the people we serve. And the only good data we've got on their needs exists today in their behaviors. So during the what is stage, we would spend often up to 50% of the time of an engagement using primarily ethnographic tools like journey mapping, job to be done, to develop a deep understanding of the people we're trying to serve. Now, one of the differences here with this research and what is, again, another bias that we have in organizations has been towards statistical significance. And the idea that all research really is about proving an idea is good. In design thinking in the what is stage, we use very small sample sizes, often less than 20, because the purpose of research during the what is stage is not to prove an idea is good, it's to inspire more creative ideas. When we use data for inspiration, issues like statistical significance are largely irrelevant. At some point when we move into testing, we're going to worry then about can we generalize this solution to a larger population? But in the short term, we're not. We're going to spend time, ideally, trying to figure out what people need and have not yet asked for. We're going to use that to create a set of criteria that talks about the ideal design, and then we're going to move into the what-if question, which is this issue of idea generation, using tools that are fairly familiar, like brainstorming and different approaches to concept development. Now, what will be different coming out of that idea generation process as we move into the next question of what wows, which is where we begin to layer the reality of our constraints back in, is that we're not going to move one perfect idea into testing. We're going to move a portfolio of ideas into testing, with this idea that the only person who can tell us what really works ultimately is the customer, and we need to give them choices to give us feedback on. And then finally, having done small conversations for feedback with customers using prototypes. And again, I think another dimension of design thinking that has been incredibly powerful that really didn't exist much in my previous life is this idea of visualization and prototyping. That even the roughest prototypes can give us much higher quality feedback from customers than just presenting them with an idea in a group. Then finally, in what works, we move into these small in-market experiments where we begin to test them. So that's the process we use. Now, I'll give you an example here from Monash Health, which is in Melbourne, Australia. It's a large university health center. When we began doing our research with Monash, we asked them if they could identify a couple of instances where they'd used design thinking in ways that had produced results. The first example they gave us was from the psychiatric walk-in clinic. And the psychiatric clinic is where people who are having drug overdoses, suicide attempts, they show up in the hospital emergency room and they're treated by the psychiatric outpatient people. Now, what they knew from looking at the data was that they had a big problem in that the interval between visits to the emergency room was getting shorter, not longer. So they had direct evidence that they were failing the people, the patients that they were trying to serve. However, it's such an interdisciplinary group of people working together in the outpatient clinic, they could never agree on a solution. They all knew they had a problem, but they had no ability to work together across their different parochial perspectives to come up with a solution. So one of them had the idea to try design thinking as an approach. And so one of the techniques they used is journey mapping. This is the journey map of a particular patient named Tom as he experienced his treatment with the psychiatric walk-in people. Now, you may wonder, why would we create a slide where you can't read what's on it? And of course, that's precisely the point. This is a ridiculous journey map. right? It's not surprising that Tom isn't getting better. He has had contacts with 3 different clinicians. He has 13 case managers. He's had 70 touch points, right, in this process. There's 18 different handoffs, and then his information is in 5 different IT systems, and they still have a bunch of paper records. So it's almost impossible to really understand all of his experience. The clinicians involved were so shocked when they looked at the experience Tom was actually having that it really shifted their thinking. Let's look somehow ways it shifted it. The first thing they realized was that they were addressing the wrong problem. It wasn't that they needed to better design interventions in Tom's case. They needed to help Tom feel cared for as a whole person. Right? So this reframing of the problem, this shifting of the very definition of the problem is so often the source of innovation. So often in innovation, we fail to come up with creative ideas because we're asking too conventional a definition of the problem. When we ask new questions, how do we help Tom feel cared for? We come up with new answers, not surprisingly. The other thing we had is the criteria for ideation shifted from the clinician's expert definition of success to what Tom was feeling as and experiencing as a patient. Now, this didn't mean that they didn't care whether Tom got better or not, but that the route to helping Tom get better was to look at the experience through his eyes rather than through their eyes as physicians and psychiatrists. Perhaps the most dramatic thing was the specialists left behind their own parochial views and together aligned in a conversation of how do we help Tom feel cared for, right? And so often in our world, breakthrough innovation requires people from different disciplines working together, right? We see that in business organizations. We certainly see it in the world at large. Polarization is to my view, probably the biggest challenge that we have in moving forward, right? We have people ideologically committed to opposite ways of thinking. Unless we can align their views, how do we hope to accomplish any creative thinking? Right? What design thinking does is it takes all those different views and says, yes, but what we have in common is there's someone we care about and we're trying to make life better for them. Can we put ideology aside and our own areas of functional expertise aside and ask, what do they need? And how do we use our capabilities to give that to them? Then finally, and I think perhaps equally important, is that for the physicians, they became emotionally engaged. Tom became a person for them, not a statistic, right? Not a number or a patient chart. Someone talked the other day about the difference between, for instance, in a hospital room, trying to improve the X-ray process by looking at a process flow map versus trying to improve an X-ray process by following a patient around who was experiencing it. Right? I think there's a common misconception that the major value driven by design thinking is just improvements in the quality of the products and services we offer. I actually think that the most significant impact of design thinking is the way it changes those of us who use it rather than those we use it for. It invites us to bring our humanity and our personal engagement into the conversation of treating someone else. And that makes all the difference in terms of the likelihood of implementation and people's willingness to work together. So for instance, this is one of the quotes from one of the physicians who was on that team working with Tom. We can think all kinds of things about how we believe the system is working, but then seeing the reality of how it was really working, it was shocking to see how far from our intentions reality had come. Patients needed someone to be present for them. Despite a flurry of activity, nothing was changing for them. We needed to feel their blockages and struggles. And when the clinicians were able to come together with that understanding and that emotional engagement around Tom's blockages, they, for the first time, were able to create a new system that has dramatically lengthened the interval between hospital visits and is moving in the correct direction. So we've done a lot of research about places like Monash, about 50 different organizations now, profit, nonprofit, government, NGO, all kinds of different institutions looking at that. And I think, again, there are some summary things we can say about how design thinking and why design thinking works. The first is that a lot of the impacts of design thinking are not easily visible or countable in our world, right? So there's a certain set of changes that are hard and measurable in our world. For instance, in our research, it's things like how many hot leads IBM got coming out of their redesign of a trade show, how Toyota reduced customer call time when they used design thinking, how hospitals like Children's Health reduced inappropriate emergency room usage that was costing a lot of money, or Mass Agro, which is a Mexican NGO focused on bringing sustainable modern farming methods to the poorest farmers in Mexico, which has seen a dramatically higher success rate with the adoption of its approaches than have other similar NGOs. So we can measure some stuff that design thinking can produce. But what's more important to me are things like the changes in perception. So we all know Net Promoter Score, and that's one way to kind of begin to capture this perception of customers as to how that looks. We're seeing a lot of work with design thinking in the federal government. It's hard to believe that there are good things happening in Washington, D.C. these days, but in fact, they just keep them a secret. But one of the major outcomes we've seen of the use of design thinking in the federal government space is employee engagement, right? People are much more engaged. They feel a part of a process. And again, from academic research, we know that engagement links to directly a whole host of business outcomes that are significantly better. So employee engagement is a big deal here. Suncorp, an Australian financial services firm, used design thinking as they merged with another organization to try and bring clarity around the new combined strategy and what that would look like. And again, saw dramatic improvements in people's understanding of the strategy, their understanding of their role in executing the strategy, and their belief in the importance of doing so. So these changes in perception, while they're not hard things we can count, they're very real and they're very important. Even harder to count, though increasingly important, are the way design thinking changes the conversation. Innovation happens in conversations. Think about our technology for conversations. Okay? If we look at digital technology, how much has digital technology advanced in the last 20 years? I mean, I hold our iPhones up, right? What's the statistic? It would take a 10-story building, 3 square blocks wide, to have produced the amount of computing power our iPhones hold in our hand today. Right? That's been the improvement in digital technology. Now think of the corresponding improvement in the human technology of how we talk to each other, or in social technology, as I think about it. I think some of us would argue things like Twitter have actually made things worse, not better, and that there's been relatively little pace in improvements in social technology to match the improvements in digital technology. For me, design thinking is a form of social technology that helps us as human beings communicate and converse in ways that make it more likely that we can find better solutions than any of us came into the room with, rather than worse ones. And again, here we see, this is the Food and Drug Administration. When you're the Food and Drug Administration, you feel that any solution requires increased regulation as an idea of solution. And in the FDA's use of design thinking, perhaps the most startling finding for them was that regulation was often not the answer to the kinds of problems that they were dealing with, and that the answer lay with other stakeholders who needed their support. The Good Kitchen is a food service in Denmark, and again, what they discovered was the reason why elderly people don't eat actually has relatively little to do with how appealing the menu is, and more to do with some deep psychological issues around aging and around loneliness and around these kinds of issues. And unless you address them, you can change the menu repeatedly and nothing will happen. Finally, and perhaps equally interesting to me, is the way in which design thinking changes how people think. The reason why Mass Agro has a substantially higher adoption rate than other NGOs is because Traditionally, these farmers, whose entire livelihood and that of their families relied exclusively on this year's crop, were not going to take the scientists' word for it, that the new methods were better. So what Mass Agro did was recruit local thought-leading farmers who planted side by side rows of crops, one using the new methodology and one using the old, and they allowed farmers to see for themselves the difference as demonstrated by people they trusted in the community, right? And that allowed them to overcome their fear of adoption and move forward. Similarly, at Children's Health, like Monash, we've talked about the shift in how clinicians think and the importance of shifting it to the patient. So kind of to sum up, there are so many benefits that in our research we observe. The most common one, and of course the one we talk about, is producing more creative ideas. But actually, I think design thinking, for instance, as a risk management strategy, teaching people how to conduct small, inexpensive experiments that make sure that our understanding doesn't get out ahead of our investment, rather doesn't get out ahead of our understanding, is really critical. So it's possible to think of design thinking as a risk management tool, I think. As a facilitator of behavioral change, improving the likelihood that the people whose behavior actually has to change to implement something, involving them in experimentation, absolutely critical. The real benefits of experimentation, I think, may be as much that we are building change readiness in the frontline people we involve in the experiments, as it is that we're testing some new idea, product, or service. Increasing the speed of innovation. Now, we know that speed is critical in business for success, right? Speed brings with it momentum. It brings competitive advantage from being a first mover. And yet, large organizations are notoriously slow. Why are they slow? One, because many of the people who work for them aren't engaged, right? Two, because we've given people so many priorities that really nothing is a priority, right? And three, because they're just confused and unaligned so that we have people in organizations working at cross purposes with each other. When you take unengaged people who are politically motivated and confused about their priorities, not surprisingly, you get slow. Right? When you engage people, you align them around a small set of core priorities, you get fast. And so increasing in speed, for instance, is one of the biggest outcomes that Forrester found when they looked at the difference between the IBM teams using design thinking and those not. One of the things I'm very excited about design thinking for is this idea of empowering local capability building. If we look at the literature in complex adaptive systems, which is really where we're all headed in the world, right? We have given up this idea that big organizations are machines and that their leaders kind of step on the gas and they go fast, right? Organizations aren't machines. They're collections of actors all working as they want, right? And the more complex and uncertain the world becomes, the more those actors are no longer controllable from the top. Success in a complex adaptive system involves pushing decision-making as low in the organization, as close to the source of local data as is possible. But in organizations, we worry about giving up control because of loss of kind of standardization and rigor. I think design thinking holds the promise of giving us the best of both worlds. A carefully implemented design thinking process produces structure and quality control and the ability to share learning across localities while still allowing local units to identify their own problems and make their own decisions. And I think this idea of local capability building is really, in large organizations, the next frontier that we have to figure out. Finally, I think the ability to convene conversations for change across difference is probably the most significant issue facing us today, right? We know that there's this paradox in diversity. Lots of academic research tells us that creativity's potential lies with diversity, right? It's hard for all of us as individuals to have a new thought that we never had before, The way we learn to think in new ways is to be in conversation with someone who thinks differently than we do. Because the idea is at the intersection of our ways of thinking are a higher order set of solutions that neither of us can see alone. We've been doing some interesting work with NASA lately, and when the folks at NASA first approached us, my response was, well, I'm as big a fan of design thinking as anyone, but I really don't understand how it gets you to Mars, since that seems to be a technical problem, and design thinking doesn't solve technical problems. And the lead scientist at NASA we were working with said, oh, but it does, because we have the greatest scientists in the world, but they cannot talk to each other. And getting to Mars requires that they talk to each other. If design thinking can help us to get them to talk, they will figure out the technology problems of how to get to Mars. And I think that's the power. I'll just leave you with one thought. And again, this is a pet peeve of mine, the kind of lure of the one-day hackathon where we walk away convinced everyone now knows design thinking. This is a quote from one of the senior physicians at Monash Medical Center, Don Campbell. And he said, some people have this view of design thinking that if you get a whole bunch of people in a room with Post-it notes, something magic happens. Right? And afterwards, you really don't quite know how you did it. Instead, you have to make it clear that there's a rigorous methodology in place that people can learn. We want to be leading edge, not bleeding edge, and you need a very structured methodology that lets you safely work through the elements. So with that, I will leave you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. You will soon be back again on the scene for some questions in the end. Now I'll introduce our second speaker, our Chief Commercial Officer, Magnus Ahlström, who is going to talk about turning design into business and how to overcome some common challenges when starting or scaling up design work at an organization. Magnus has been using design method as part of his business development work since beginning of 2000, and in both multinational companies as well as in startups in Europe and also in Asia, actually. Help me, yeah. Welcome again, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the introduction, and what a great honor to be on the same stage as you, Jeanne. I mean, I feel honored and a bit starstruck, actually, as well. But what I really think strongly about is that we share the same passion for design and for the customers. Because if you look at it, who is not to love the customer? I mean, customer centricity is key to any organization. Now, you would argue that the reason for an organization to exist is actually to create some kind of value to that customer. But how does companies or organizations find out what that kind of value actually is? Well, Jeanne touched on that. We use a lot of data, because we collect a lot of data from our customer interactions today. We make buying consumer behaviors, mapping, and we do a lot of other stuff around that, but that doesn't tell us anything about what the actual needs of the customers are. And we heard about this great methodology, or called design thinking or design methodology, which actually gives you something outside the actual touch point of your company, something that talks about what are the greater goals of your customers, what are they want to achieve, not just in the interaction with you and your company. They don't go into a bank office because they love to get loans, they want to buy something, and how is that affecting them before and after they meet with you? So, knowing that, we have the answers. We know that customer centricity, that's super important to all companies, organizations, and whatsoever. And design methodology is a great tool to use. So why is it so hard to start for companies? Well, there are some companies or decisions-making in companies that still thinks that design is all about colors and shapes, but they couldn't be more wrong. In this context that we talked about right now before, is that the end game, to really leverage the full potential of design, it needs to be integrated as a part of the organization, in all parts of the organizations. And in order to do that, you need to start somewhere. And if you think design is about color and shapes, you need to understand the actual cornerstones or the foundations of design methodology. And Jeanne touched on them as well, and as she said, there is as many ways of expressing design methodology as that there are consultancies or academics. But our way, in this case, I'd say there are 5 important steps from our perspective. And the first step is for sure that you base all your ideas on understanding your customers' needs in a bigger context, not just what they need more or less with your specific product, but what they need to achieve that goal and how you can support that. And you have excellent tools around that, like customer journey mapping, etc., that help you doing that. The second part is prioritizing your actual ideas, because I never met a company that hasn't like hundreds of ideas in buckets and on desks all over the place. And the big challenge is for those companies, which idea should we focus on? Because everyone loves their own ideas, so they want to start with them. I will not kill my baby or my darling. But using design insight on the customer value makes it much easier to prioritize. Thirdly, test your ideas. Test early, prototype them. The design methodology is full with different excellent tools like trigger material, like lo-fi prototypes, hi-fi prototypes that you can use to do these kind of things. Fourthly, the co-creation part, of course, is very important in order to break silos within companies, to get everyone on board, understanding what the common goal that they are striving for is. That can happen if everyone is working against one another. And finally, the fifth part from our perspective is to launch early, launch fast. You don't need to wait until you have what you think is the perfect product. It's better to launch early using if you're a product company, for example, you could use the minimum viable product or minimum lovable product approach, where you find a minimum set of features in a product that your customer will perceive as hugely valuable for them, and start launching there. So the methodology makes sense, I think. What do you think? I mean, it's not like it's kind of rocket science, and believe us, at Daresay, we know about rocket science because we're working with the Swedish space corporations. We know a lot with NASA and so on. But there is still some challenges that we meet in our interaction when we work with different customers that are pretty common, whether you're just starting off implementing your design methodology, or if you started off and you want to scale it up. And it comes back to the challenges of what is the everyday business of the companies. And there are 5 different areas that we often see that you might recognize as being, I think the battery is running out of this. That would be really odd. So the first one, we often see, we talked about that, the knowledge gap or the bias. And it's coming back to what I just talked about, that people in companies, often decision makers, don't really understand what design is, and this talk about customers. Well, every company see themselves as being customer centric in some way. In our experience, the best way to overcome this knowledge gap is to experience, to start doing things, because you can read as many books as you want, but until that day that you actually being involved in a design process, that's when something really happens to you. And I guess you could sort of relate to other things in your life where you have had a lot of thoughts in theory, and once you experience it for the first time, it goes, oh, wow, it was like this. That was really excellent. So the second part is existing company structures, because we have existing company structures today. We are divided into a structure to often meet the actual purpose of the company, which often isn't customer centricity, but product centricity. You have a product, you want to sell it as profitable as possible. And what happens then is that you have existing targets, priorities, and plan, and which results that you have no capacity to do anything new in a new way. The trick to overcome this, in our experience, is to start small. You need to work cross-functional, but start small. You could do it in sprint format, but any way you do it, it's important that you get a tangible result of what you're doing. You not start off just some people sitting in a room, potentially being designers, doing something fancy. You need to involve a lot of people. You need to come up with something concrete, like a prototype that can show around in the organization. That's the way to start from our perspective. We've done some recent work with a huge hospital here in Stockholm where we worked, I think you saw it on the way in, with ways to improve the experience for people who are coming on to get an operation. And we started off with a short project for a week. The people at that hospital got the material to start moving around inside the hospital and to actually show the value of continue doing this. And we got a chance to continue to do that, which resulted in a huge benefit for the patients, for sure. Third, expert culture. Everyone knows best. That's one of the big things in companies, and that really comes with two great challenges from a design perspective, because the first one is that you will not talk to customers if you know everything yourself. And the second part is that in this type of cultures, there is often a view that you look down on failure. So it's important not to fail in these kind of companies, which is total contrast to what design is about. I mean, Jeanne talked about the importance of innovation. If you think about it, many failures as a company equals that you're actually testing a lot of ideas. And if you test a lot of ideas, then you actually are having a high innovation rate per definition. So there are some tools to help companies and experts to overcome this. It's rapid prototyping. Just the other week, I was in the same room as 20 CEOs and board members of a huge Eastern European insurance company that was looking at one another very scared the first 5 minutes. And then we introduced some tools, and after 45 minutes, all of them had come up with the first prototype and of idea they generated together with glittery papers and signals and stuff. So something happens when you put people into a situation, you give them the correct curating to do this type of innovation. Fourth one is something that we hear a lot of time. I mean, the burden of the technical legacy the company has, because there is no company in the world that doesn't have some kind of legacy when it comes to IT infrastructure, etc. But all the IT departments and all of the companies think that they are unique. Say, oh, I understand that everyone else can do this very quick, rapid prototyping or whatever you're talking about. But we have, our systems are 40, 50 years old. But if you think about it, actually, I mean, companies like Spotify and the ones that you think are digital at core, even them have a legacy, because after a year, there is a legacy. And the trick that we often do, I think, to overbridge this is that instead of, which company often does that they go to the IT department with a list of requirements that, please, IT department, fix this for us. You involve the IT department, cross-functionally working, finding out, okay, what is it actually we're going to do for the customer? What we're going to help the customer with? Please innovate together, help us to find a solution to that. And when you do that, when you put together business, the technology and everyone in the same room, then really magic starts to happen. And the fifth part is partly the one that we talked about today, because what is the actual business value of design in the head of the people that sits on the money in the company, who decides on what you're going to invest in and not? And even that we know, which Jeanne very clearly spoke about earlier, that there's a lot of benefits from a business value perspective, culture, etc. It often comes down to the very basic numbers. And even if you know that the research from McKinsey, Forrester, etc., shows that there is, on a high level, a huge value from a monetary perspective to invest in design. How do you boil that down to the business case that you're going to show your CFO to get approval to invest in the research or the design that you would like to do in the company? Well, there is no easy answer to that, and I think maybe it's because it's like different breeds, if you think about designers and the traditional business people, and they speak different languages as well. So I will try to introduce an idea that we've been working on, and that is because the situation, I mean, companies been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the structures that you sort of measure your company has also been very cemented in education, etc. So if you, for example, take a revenue perspective, and there's a lot of bubbles up here, so bear with me. But what I'm trying to say with this picture is basically that, I mean, there is some kind of business value that is often measured in the revenue that the company delivers. Okay. And how do you calculate that revenue? Well, you have some customer base. The magic customer is back here. And if it's a big customer base, potentially you will get a lot of revenues, yeah? But the customers themselves doesn't generate revenues. You need to have some kind of KPI that look at the revenue that you expect these customers to deliver to your company during the period of time that they are customers with you. And business people often call this customer lifetime value, and it's not about the lifetime in terms of when you're born and dies. It's about for how long time you will actually be a customer with your company. And if you look at the white bubbles represent different drivers that most companies measure. So, for example, if everything else is the same, but you manage to decrease churn, which is the business word for customers that leaves you. If less customers leave you and everything is the same, then probably your customer base will grow, and so will your revenues. Looking at the other business drivers, the same applies for sure. If the customer stays with you for a longer time, it will produce revenues for a longer time over time. And if you know this coming from the design, or if you're gonna put together your business case on design, one opportunity, just as an example, if we look at the part where average cost to deliver your actual product. Here is an area, for example, where design methodology could be of value. In what way? Well, if you look at this picture, based on research, actually shows that if you, using the design process, if you early on in the design process, when you're testing ideas with customers that we talked about, compared to after you launch the actual products, the ratio is 1 to 100 in terms of cost to change the product. So when you have that number, then suddenly you can start building your argumentation towards the business case and the assumptions you do in that business case. Finally, if there is 3 things that I want you to take along when you leave here, is that the first or the main thing I would say actually is to dare to start. Daring is very important, and a lot of people talk about design thinking, but very few comes over the threshold to actually start doing that. And I think you can do this in different ways. I mean, I imagine that you represent companies in here that are in a different stage of design maturity, if there is something that you can call like that. But I think whatever you do, I mean, it's like an analogy that I was thinking about is like it's one. If you're doing your whitewash at home, can you imagine put it in the machine, and you have one red sock and you put it in the machine by purpose, and what happens is that, well, you get some color on your whitewash, don't you? Yeah. And that might be a bad thing when you do your whitewashes at home. But what I mean with that is that you need to start somewhere, because all the actions that you take within the company, even if they're small, like starting to have a dialogue with the customer, which actually forces you to go out and meet your customer, not just look on the statistics. All of those stories that will generate from that visit with the customer will be spread over the organization, so they will get to know more about design thinking. A senior vice president at a huge truck company a couple of miles south of Stockholm, no names of the company, but he for surely have met one truck driver in his life, because every time I meet this guy, he talks about the truck driver and his pains and gains, and it's a huge thing to him. So powerful is it for everyone actually to do this thing, to go out, talk to the customer in their environment, to understand their needs in a bigger perspective. The second one is, I talked about that before, start small. You're bound to fail if you try to do everything at once. I think you can start small depending on where you are in level of maturity. You could do design sprints, which is a well-renowned tool. We've done that with Nobel Prize winners at the Nobel Museum. We've done that with all different types of competences, but cross-functional all the time. You learn from one another, you experience something together. Or if you are a bit further down in the maturity line, you could focus on a specific area of business, for example, or a specific product that you say, okay, we're going to work together using design methodology with this product. And finally, if you're really mature, one really good way, and what's almost missing in companies all the time, is the customer experience roadmap. You have a huge IT roadmap with a lot of things that depending on that IT roadmap. But actually, if you're going to deliver value to the customer, you really need to have a customer experience roadmap. That should be the mother of all roadmaps in my book. So, yes, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Magnus. As we are more than 200 people here today from different industries, different organizations, we thought that we just have to take the temperature of the culture of innovation in the organization that you represent here today. So we thought we'd do a very quick service, and that could also be the starting point for the questions in the end. Do we actually work design-driven? At my company, it's okay to fail, learn, and move on. We share and discuss customer insights in meetings regularly. We always test ideas and prototypes on customers. We work in multidisciplinary teams when innovating. And the last one, we launch products or services fast and release often. All right, that's a great starting point for our short Q&A session here. Please welcome again Jeanne and Magnus. So as a starting point, let's move back to the first question here, to our audience here. At my company, it's okay to fail, learn, and move on. What do you think of the results we see here? Jeanne, any comments?
I think we have an unusually enlightened group of companies represented in this room. I think in most organizations, that number of disagree and disagree strongly would probably be 80% at least. I think the reluctance to fail is probably, and the fear is probably the single biggest impediment to innovation in most organizations, right? And we can't even blame that on the organizations. Most of us, there's some wonderful research by a Stanford psychologist called Carol Dweck that some of you may have read, called Mindsets. And she argues, quite independent of business people, based on her research on elementary school children, that early in our lives, most of us pick up a mindset where we're taught to equate being correct with being intelligent. And so for the rest of our lives, we make choices based on avoiding making mistakes so that people don't think we're not intelligent. So I think that's hardwired into many of us, and then that just gets exacerbated by corporate cultures where good managers don't make mistakes is the prevailing myth. So that's why I think the start small aspect that Magnus talked about is so critical. It runs so much against the grain to ask people to do new things in a very visible way. And so we need to create psychological safety for people with structures and with the ability to conduct these small experiments and start small.
And if we take the next one here. We share and discuss customer insights in meetings regularly. disagree it's quite higher. What do you think about that, Magnus?
Well, again, I mean, I think it's quite many that agree actually, so that's a good sign as well in terms of the audience. I mean, I think it's often a way that you miss a structured way to communicate customer insights, and also because that you are not really involved in retrieving those kind of insights. I think what is really powerful, what I talked about before, is actually when you work in these cross-functional teams, you sit in and you actually hear the customer react to your product or service, or react to your or explaining their goals or whatever. That's really powerful as well. And yeah.
There is a question here from the audience. Design thinking is good to create great customer value, but do you also need to filter, or how do you filter on success from a financial perspective? How do you combine that?
Well, I would say, this is the accountant in me speaking, right? At some level, business profitability is not very complex, right? I mean, there's revenues, and you either grow your revenues or you decrease your costs. You can grow your revenues, Michael Porter would say, right, by either differentiating your product or competing on price. Right? Most of us prefer not to compete on price because we know that's a spiral race to the bottom. So on the revenue side, I think there's quite a direct link between design thinking's ability to help us improve our value propositions, to make them more unique and differentiated and out ahead of our competitors, that contributes directly to the kind of revenue focus that Magnus was talking about. And on the cost side, what it costs us to deliver is about the efficiency and speed of teams. It's about people working together in an aligned kind of way. It's about not risking more resources than we need to in advance of what we know. These are all directly related to decreasing our costs. So the accountant in me looks at our studies, which appear to be qualitative, right, in terms of team performance and things, but sees that they link very directly to organizational profitability by both increasing revenues and decreasing costs.
And I must add as well, I mean, my background is in financial management. I also have this number crunching background, and I really enjoy it actually. But I think when it comes down to practice, to put what I was talking about before, to put this into the actual business case, and in all organization, when you do a business case, it's around assumptions as well, and you need to be as persuasive as possible when you sort of stand up for the numbers that you put into that business case. And my firm belief is that you see the values that Jeanne is talking about from design thinking. You need to articulate it in a way to make it sort of stick in that conversation, basically.
Yeah. I just think this question of the burden of proof is one of the big issues that we have to deal with, though. The reality of it is, you cannot prove that any given new future is the right one by extrapolating with data from the past. If we're trying to invent a new future, by definition, data from the past will not allow us to demonstrate or prove that it's true. In my experience as a BCG consultant, what I discovered is one of the great advantages of being a consultant is people allow you to make up numbers, right? Because literally you have to construct an argument that is based on a lot of leaps of faith to take existing data and make a case for a new future. In most organizations, no one other than expensive consultants are ever allowed to make up numbers. And if you can't make up numbers, you can't deliver proof. And so managers are caught in this paralysis where instead of going out into the market and conducting low-cost experiments, they're trapped in conference rooms, repopulating Excel spreadsheets in PowerPoint presentations and learning nothing, right? So I think the advantage of hypothesis-driven methodologies is, instead of giving the people who doubt our proof the veto power to keep us in the conference room arguing, we work together to design an experiment to test the numbers that they disbelieve. And we all get out of the conference room and actually talk to real customers and begin to learn together.
The last question, also from the audience, is quite a big question, but maybe it's possible to answer it in a short way. In your mind, is directed to you, Jane. In your mind, is design thinking inherently good, or is it also used to create negative impact, like for humans or the environment? In other words, if it creates harm, do you think design thinking failed?
Yeah. It can absolutely create harm, right? At some level, design thinking is just a more sophisticated methodology to manipulate people than the ones we currently have. And so, like any tool, I think it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. And it is very difficult to control what it's used for. Of course, in the US, we live with the example of Cambridge Analytica, right? All that data on people getting to influence their voting patterns, it's real. There is, I think, a real ethical dimension to this. But I think if we abandon tools because they can be used for bad purposes as well as good, we won't really have any tools left. So I think what we need to do instead is to begin to have an open conversation about the use of these new tools in relationship to their ability to manipulate, as opposed to their ability to create better value, and address it, because it's one of those irreconcilable tensions. It will never go away because the bad people will not stop using it because we tell them it's not a good thing to do, right? And so we need to constantly, I think, be vigilant and have that discussion of what's actually happening and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate as a society.
Thank you.
But I'd like to add, I mean, I think a lot of the companies that we see that really adopts design thinking, like early adopters of design thinking, they are, I would say that they are to the greatest extent driven by the empathy part of the design, that you really want to understand the customer to deliver something bigger to the customer, not necessarily move them in the other direction. Like, yeah.
Okay, I think that question and that answer is a very good end to this seminar. We heard today that design thinking and creating business value is not a one-man show. And engagements within the whole organization is crucial. And it could be used both for bad and good, and let us focus on the later one. But now we would like to finally thank Jeanne and Magnus for this morning's